We progress now with the subjunctive into the non-indicative moods of Greek verbs. If you grab your table of contents, you notice that we have another section overview on page 349, and this is the final section overview. Already in Greek, we have thought about nouns, and Mounts gave us section overviews in nouns. We went on to think about the indicative verbs, and Mounts gave us a couple of section overviews there. We thought about participles, and likewise a section overview. And now here with the subjunctive, we begin the non-indicative verbs. And that's what we look at with the subjunctive here in chapter 31. Let's pray together. Lord, help students to bring the ideas of verbs together and their nuances. Give them a sense of confidence as they remember what cues an indicative verb, the various factors that help them to identify the participle and the constituent elements of the participle, and now the non-indicatives and the subjunctive. I ask in Christ's name, amen. So to review, the indicative verb states an indication of reality from the speaker or writer's perspective. Even when we're thinking about the future time, the future tense form, we're still thinking about a statement in their perspective of reality. That distinguishes from the subjunctive, because the subjunctive is not necessarily reality, it's a statement of a hypothesis. You notice that Mounts uses the language of possibility or probability. I think that's true, and again, we have key words like may or might that we use to translate the subjunctive, but I think another way to think of the subjunctive is to think of it in terms of hypothesis or theory. It's explanation, not hypothesis in a pejorative sense, well, hypothetically speaking, or in a doubtful sense, though there may be a suspension of reality involved. It's hypothesis, it's explaining, it's looking under the hood with someone who's a car expert, and they are helping you to understand why all the parts are there. The subjunctive is exegetically just so significant. If you want to peek ahead at John 17, you will see the use of the subjunctive there in Jesus explaining to the disciples why he's going away. It's John 17 where we can see the use of the subjunctive. And different than the indicative, it's not that Jesus is not speaking about reality, he's rather explaining what's happening. And soon we'll think about the imperative. The imperative is different because it's a statement of command, and often a statement of urgency that cues the imperative. It's now, and give attention to something. Well, all of this requires us to identify what part of speech we are in, whether we are in the indicative or the subjunctive. So I'm going to just write indicative just above here with the abbreviation in for the reminder that we have two moods that we have thought about so far. First, the indicative, and now here the subjunctive. And on the charts that follow, I will provide the indicative as well as the subjunctive so that you can differentiate them. We start, since we're in verbs, again, there's a root that is beneath the surface. We pull up the present tense stem from that root. Whatever the present is, that's what we pull in here with the subjunctive, just as in the indicative. What clues us to the subjunctive is the lengthened connecting vowel. Now, along the way, you have noticed that with each of the various parts of speech, there's some kind of a clue. Well, here, that clue is a lengthened connecting vowel. The omicron lengthens to omega, epsilon lengthens to eta. And we have primary personal endings, nothing new there. That is typical for the present indicative as well. So our stem and then our lengthened connecting vowel. We would expect an omicron there, but instead we have the lengthened omega. With the middle passive, same. So the present active subjunctive, and here's the paradigm. Again, we have our primary ending, cementi nsi. With the indicative, we can see again how that works out, luo, lues, lue, and so forth. Well, here we have with the subjunctive the exact same form because there is no personal ending, and here in the indicative, that omicron lengthens to omega to compensate for the loss. And here there's an omega because the subjunctive requires the connecting vowel to lengthen. We begin to see distinction here with lues. The lengthened epsilon going to eta and iota subscript, and you can see the pattern here. Epsilon to eta, omicron to omega, epsilon to eta, and then we remember that that omega is, you think of it like a crab or something. It's hungry, it's going to eat. It's a very strong vowel that's going to eat up other vowels. So as soon as that lengthens, it eats up the upsilon there and becomes omega. So the present active subjunctive, that lengthened connecting vowel from omicron to omega, or epsilon to eta, that's our cue. With the middle passive, same. We have this lengthened connecting vowel pattern, omicron to omega, and you see it here. Now, one note, again, the contraction, the sigma drops out. This is not a new pattern for us in alpha. Here we have this indicative, the same as the subjunctive, because of the contraction required with the sigma, but over here we don't have a sigma involved necessarily. We have this lengthening, though the sigma drops out. We have the lengthening because of the required subjunctive lengthened connecting vowel. Otherwise, the pattern is exactly the same, epsilon to eta and so forth. Now here, we're going to have to rely upon context to determine if we are in the indicative or whether we are in the subjunctive. So with the second singular, as we'll see with the aorist in a few moments, we're dependent upon context, indicative or subjunctive. There will be some cues outside of the verb for the subjunctive that we'll see in just a moment. So a couple of cues outside of the verb in the context that can help us to differentiate between an indicative and a subjunctive, though at times the form will be the same, and we just have to keep an open mind in terms of translation. Is it you are being loosed versus you may be loosed? Or let me explain how the loosing of you is going to come about. When we think about the aorist subjunctive, again, we have our root and then our unaugmented stem. Here is the first nuance of the aorist subjunctive. The unaugmented stem is different for us because with the subjunctive, we are outside of time. We have thought already about the aorist and the relationship of time in the aorist with the subjunctive and secondary endings, but here we have primary because we're outside of time. Therefore, we don't need an augment and we don't need the secondary endings. We use the primary endings. So two nuances then with the aorist. First, unaugmented. Second, primary and not secondary endings. But we recognize that these two go together with the concept of time being eliminated because these two factors always signal past time with the indicative. With the first aorist, there are two tense formatives. We're used to the first aorist active and middle being sigma alpha, but here we're reduced just to sigma so that we can maintain that lengthened connecting vowel. With the passive, just theta. You notice again that the lengthened connecting vowel is the cue to the subjunctive. Just as we had with the present, we will continue to have with the aorist. One final note, just as with the indicative, the aorist passive uses active endings. That we need to refresh ourselves in, but that's not new. That was the same with the indicative. So here are a couple of examples. Here's our tense formative, lengthened connecting vowel. In the second aorist, remember there is no tense formative there in the second aorist, so we just have the second aorist stem, which again is often very close to the root in terms of all the tense stems, which is closest to the root. It's the second aorist, and then we have our lengthened connecting vowel again. So here's the paradigm for the first, or the aorist active subjunctive. I'm going to have both first and second aorist here. Here are our first aorist and then our second aorist. Notice again, I have the indicative for you, and then that's followed by the subjunctive. You may want to pause the screencast and just look over this for a moment, or pause it as I talk here, and you can notice the connections along the way. Now, in the next couple of slides, where I have an asterisk is where this particular form resembles another, and here luso, if you just saw the word luso in a text, what would you think? Well, if we're remembering back through indicative verbs, this form is exactly the same as the future active indicative first singular. So when we come to the word luso in a text, or this form, the future active indicative and the first aorist subjunctive in form may be exactly the same. And again, we're dependent upon context if this is the mood of theory or the mood of reality from the speaker's perspective. And again, there'll be some cues in a moment. We'll see with the subjunctive to help us differentiate. But by form, it could be the same. Now, we do need to keep in mind there are many instances where the aorist and future active here do not have the same stem. The stem might be different, and we can see our charts that we have referred to in the back of Mounts over and over to remind ourselves of the differences. That chart beginning on page 450 can remind us of the differences in root and stem, but the stem used by the future, or the stem in the text, the different roots for the aorist and the future, could help us to differentiate here. But in form, the ending may look the same. Well, if we look at the aorist subjunctive, then we can see there's our sigma, the lengthened connecting vowel, and lengthened connecting vowel, again, lengthened connecting vowel with the sigma. What's going to begin to clue you here is this combination of tense formative sigma, lengthened connecting vowel, and on the front end, we're missing something. There is no augment. With the second aorist, no augment all the way down, and a very compact arrangement in the word. We have just our stem and then the lengthened connecting vowel and the personal endings. And what will be sometimes difficult for us is to put the primary endings, like cementi-nsi here, to put that on an aorist stem will be difficult for us at first, but we'll just have to work through the process. Again, you can see here, augment, augment, augment all the way down, no augment here. Are you seeing the differences then? First aorist indicative, first aorist subjunctive, second aorist indicative, second aorist subjunctive. Here we're in the actives. We'll look at middles and passives in just a moment. In the translation that Mounts suggest could or may as the keyword, again, those kinds of modal words cue us to hypothesis or theory. Let me explain, if you will. I could do something versus just the indicative translation, I am doing something. He, she, it could, may, might, as opposed to the indicative, he, she, it did. Having thought about the active aorist, now let's think about the middle, and yes, passive next. We have here the first aorist indicative, and then the subjunctive. second aorist, indicative, subjunctive. Remember, with the first aorist, there are a couple of cues for us that remind us that we are in the subjunctive. One is just the sigma tense formative, not sigma alpha. Second, the lengthened connecting vowel, like this omega here. And we're reminded as well that if we think of all the cues that differentiate indicative from subjunctive and aorist, we think about the beginning of a word. And there's no augment, so if there's no augment, we are also in primary, not secondary endings. That's why we have my here and not main. Why we have this iota here and not the saw ending that is behind the so. Again, we have this combination sigma alpha, sigma omicron here, and this sigma drops out, alpha and omicron become omega, and that's how we get the so in the second singular aorist indicative. The lengthened connecting vowel will be a cue for you. The simplified tense formative, just a sigma. No augment, primary endings back here. Those are the cues for the first aorist subjunctive. Second aorist subjunctive, again, no augment, so we have primary endings. We have no tense formative, so it's just the stem that we look at for the second aorist, but we have that lengthened connecting vowel all the way through that's going to cue us that we are in the subjunctive mood. Now here with the second singular, loose aorist active subjunctive second singular is going to be exactly equal to the future active, or excuse me, future middle indicative. These are both middle, I think I said active. Future middle indicative verb is going to be the same as the future middle subjunctive. It's going to look the same as far as endings go. Now again, there may be a difference between the stem that's used for the aorist and the future, but the endings will look the same. The passive then, the aorist principles that we have seen all the way across between the indicative and the subjunctive, no augment. Here we have the differentiation again, again with the endings. If we have no augment, then the first aorist subjunctive is going to be in primary endings, the indicative secondary, and just as the indicative used secondary active endings, these are all active endings here, the new, sigma, no ending, men, te, new here, lengthened son, the alternative ending, those are all active endings. Same principle here. The aorist passive, whether subjunctive or indicative, always use active endings. And that's what we have here with the subjunctive as well. So active endings, we note that the tense formative is just the theta, not theta epsilon as the participle, or theta eta as the indicative, just the reduced theta, but we always have that lengthened connecting vowel to cue us. So if we come to this word, we see the theta, that's going to cue us to aorist passive. We see the lengthened connecting vowel. We know we're in the subjunctive, and we can confirm that by no augment and the primary endings. Again, the aorist perfective subjunctive. There's a root and then the unaugmented stem. Because there's no augment, we are in primary, not secondary endings. The first aorist, sigma, for the active and middle, theta for the passive, and the lengthened connecting vowel with the aorist as with the present is a clue to the subjunctive. Contract verbs, we come back from chapter 17 here and remind ourselves of all the contraction patterns. I noted them on a couple of slides previously, but contract verbs, because of the contraction patterns, can resemble the indicative. So with some contracts, the indicative and the subjunctive are exactly the same. Now, sometimes there's some nuances, but sometimes they're the same. Because of that, we need to be open to context to determine if the author is speaking about reality or some kind of an explanation with the subjunctive. So I've noted here for you with the asterisk, those either full contraction patterns or individual instances where the indicative and subjunctive are exactly the same, and we need to look to context to determine meaning. Because of the contraction pattern with the alpha, and again, go back to chapter 17, and you can see the alpha contraction pattern. Because of that, and because the alpha here is going to line up in many cases with an eta of a lengthened vowel, that eta is just going to drop off because behind it was an epsilon, and those epsilons are weak. And our result is going to be that with the subjunctive, the indicative is going to be exactly the same with alpha contracts like gen-ao. Remember here, once gen-ao is dropped into a text and there is no ending used, the omicron lengthens to omega. That omega becomes live and eats up that alpha. That's literally what happens. I'm using a sort of a metaphor from the world of animal kingdom of eating up, but that's what happens. That omega is lengthened and it takes away the alpha. So you can look back at chapter 17 for how that pattern works. You see the same with the omega there. Otherwise, that epsilon just drops out. You can see here that alpha is from gen-ao, and beneath the circumflex there, that epsilon that lengthened to eta. Again, there was an epsilon here. It lengthened to eta for the subjunctive, but it dropped out because it's weaker and that alpha held. Over here with the epsilon contracts and the omicron contracts, just a few instances where the indicative and subjunctive are the same. Otherwise, we can see how easy it is to recognize the subjunctive with that lengthened connecting vowel all the way through. So take a look back at page 176 for the contraction patterns, as well as here this slide is represented from page 358 in Mounce's textbook on subjunctives. So use of the subjunctive, I hinted along the way that there are places where if the subjunctive and the indicative are the same, if they're equal, how are you going to know when there is a legitimate subjunctive use? Well, here are those cues outside of the subjunctive. The word hina, eon, and heos, those words will cue us that we are dealing with a subjunctive and not an indicative. And they have exegetical insight for us. Hina is often related to purpose. Eon, some kind of a condition. Heos, some kind of a temporal idea. Of these, hina is especially important. It's a cue that the author is explaining something and giving us the purpose of some action and using the subjunctive to do that in its classical sense of theory or hypothesis. Negation with the subjunctive. The negation of a subjunctive can be the author's attempt to negate something very strongly. So if there is the idea of hina, which we've seen already as purpose, with may or may, Remember, in the non-indicatives, we usually use may. The indicative on its own uses oo. If these are put together, it's a very strong purpose so that blank will not happen. Same with eon and heos. Heos being until, and the condition statement, if not, then the main verb clause will likely result. Our vocab, just a couple of words: lithos, toiutos. Lithotripsy is a procedure to break up a stone in your body, I think a kidney stone or something like that. Lithography. Mounts notes: toiutos, a toy of such a kind. If a person wants a certain toy kid, then you're going to want this kind and not another kind. If you have children, you shop for them, you know that you need to be particular in your shopping. Continue to press on a lot of information here with the subjunctive, but continue to go with what you know and progress with the ideas in looking at the forms, keeping in mind the nuances of that lengthened connecting vowel and the simplified tense formatives for the aorist. Big picture, the indicative is different than the subjunctive because the subjunctive is a mood of hypothesis, explanation, theory. There may be some reality involved, but the author's wanting to explain, to give some kind of a suspension of exact reality.